prairies, a muse as abundant and creatively ripe as any. I was back 1 year later for a celebration of life. Everything was as it was then. It's hard to even imagine that the winter had come and gone. There on the farm, it felt as if everything could have been an endless summer. Every day since I left, it was the same sunset streaming golden light over the canola flower and freshly sprouting wheat. Here there's crawfish in the creek, white sage that grows like weeds, prairie dogs scuttling in between the grass, mosquitoes that swarm as the sun goes down, cicadas, and the dry heat you can feel puckering up the soft skin underneath your lip. Almost 5 years ago now, I sat at that spot near the creek, on the farm, reading All About Love by Bell Hooks. At only 18, I didn't know much about love, but I felt important and worldly, being so young and considering what love meant as a verb. I was celebrating my grandparents' wedding anniversary, half a decade together. I had not known anyone then who would love me a few months, much less 50 years. Except my parents, but the teenage years are a time when a parent's love is not enough. There are other ways we dream of being loved. Last year was my great-grandmother's celebration of life. Candles and punch out of a glass bowl in the gymnasium. This July, another celebration of life with a far different tone. There was a deep emptiness that had settled over the far-reaching fields. An aching that is only reserved for the loss of someone young. For all the grand possibilities that now remain discarded on the side of the road. How can you honor them without saying it was too soon? I am on earth, still bound by time. How could I know what is too soon? I resist it, though it remains on the tip of my tongue. Up on the hill, there is a cairn where I've communed with the dead for as long as I can remember. Rocks from all over the world are piled up high. Death inaugurated it 18 years ago, and we returned to be with loss and to sit with new ones. Like the mountains, they too will erode and change, protracted and diffused across the long durée of time. But to us, as a symbol, they are solid, sturdy, and permanent, amidst all of our fleshy bodies that are subject to loosening, softening, puncturing, and of course death. They symbolize what is impossible to put into words. The way that loss pools and collects in space through time, and that something else, that feeling of wanting to hold on to life as it demands us to let go. To the airport, we were listening to a Ram Dass podcast in silence. Listening to his voice while gliding across the expansive, never-ending road felt surreal. Like when you take an eye test and there's an image of a house at the end of the road, it slowly gets brought into focus. You know that it isn't real, and yet there is something of a nostalgic feeling for that space that you will never reach. We are human, and it's not an error. His voice came from my phone through the car speaker and across time. Something clicked into place. We are not here on earth to become pure and rid ourselves of what is human and fallible. Our pettiness, triviality, and even cruelty is not an error. There is that part of ourselves that is infinite, beyond our bodies, belonging to the ether. But we are also here to experience that other part, that which we know most readily to be ourselves. The finite, the body, the earthly, the lowly, the human. We pass the lone tree on the side of the highway as always. There are many winter nights in my childhood, thick under a layer of jet lag, dozing off in the back, where a car horn would awaken me. The lonely tree that you must honk at as you pass. Now I see it for what it is. a ritual and a divine moment of witnessing. In Spain, I made a small altar at the base of a 200-year-old tree alone in a field. This feels like a similar impulse, calling out to it as we pass and acknowledging its sentience. I'm here, and so are you. I see you. Do you see me? This tree was around when my grandfather was a boy, and it will most likely carry on as it was long after I returned to the dirt. There must be something nice about experiencing the long stretch of time in such a way. If you ask me about love now, these are the anecdotes I would offer. It was on that very plane ride that I decided to stay. It is the Venus retrograde this week, and I find that all of my conversations have been about love. How do we love? How have we been loved? And how do we love others? I remember when I first read All About Love, that feels very canonical to these questions. It was sort of like the first text I ever engaged with that took love as a serious and important discourse. In her most famous assertions, she talks about how love is a verb. It is an action and not a noun, static in time. The word love is most often defined as a noun, yet all of the more astute theorists of love acknowledge that we would all love better if we used it as a verb. We don't have to love, we actively choose to do so. Another important kind of often quoted passage of Hook's work is when she kind of discussed that abuse cannot coexist with love. When people are actively abusing you, you can't say that they're loving you. When we understand love as the will to nurture our own and another's spiritual growth, it becomes clear that we cannot claim to love if we are hurtful and abusive. Love and abuse cannot coexist. Abuse and neglect are by definition the opposites of nurturance and care. Is this true? Can love only exist in the highest states of nurturance, compassion, and care? I've been sitting on this since I was 18, finding myself and others worshiping at the altar of love as a verb. And yet, I couldn't help this nagging feeling that there was more to this. In moments where no one was choosing to do so, could love still exist? Is love unconditional in such a way, still present when we refuse it? How do we even define what love is? Does love always have to be inherently good with the purest of intentions? Back in November, in a previous newsletter, I asserted boldly that love is neutral. This is something I've been returning to time and time again since that realization. Unconditional, capital L love exists beyond the human binaries of good and bad. It is present with all that is. It meets us exactly where we are. There is nothing we need to do to earn it. This love, I suppose, is a verb in that it is active in the present moment. But the verb is not doing, but being. If love is a verb, it would be to be. It just is. Love is being. This, in many ways, is the closest I could get to what God is. But this doesn't feel like it all either. There's this other aspect of love that is both doing, loving. Maybe as there's two dimensions of ourselves, the one that belongs to the ether and the one that belongs to the earth. As is the way with love. There are two dimensions of it, the infinite and the finite. Both are equally important components of exploring love, neither more or less important than the other. They feed and inform each other. As our earthly selves inform and expand our infinite self teaches and informs our earthly self. Maybe it's the same for love. We are human, and it's not an error. Finite love might seem pejorative or lower in ranking, and yes, it is lowly, close to the earth, but just as important. It might just be why we're here. This finite love is our earthly curriculum, so to speak, offering us pathways back to infinite love. Relationships are its medium, romance and care are its creative outlets. This love knows conditions, boundaries, doings, and endings. It is about the act of loving, requiring a relational experience with the other. In this sense, it requires in many ways that separation, the you and the me. Even self-love requires that split. This memory resurfaced of listening to the audiobook of The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle on a subway platform. The wind of the train might have been whipping through my hair, or else the train was late and I was waiting. He was explaining how he thought self-love was a grand contradiction. It required the split between the self that was doing the loving and the self that was receiving the love. In self-love, there is not unity with the oneness, but another separation. Though separation has its use, we couldn't really be on earth without it. Self-love in many ways is too a finite love. It requires the self that will eventually dissipate with death. Nevertheless, it is a worthwhile pursuit in this lifetime. Conditions are necessary in loving, and I think this is what Hooks was getting at. Abuse can't coexist with this finite love. There are conditions, and that loving can't be present without the acts of care, compassion, and tenderness. It is putting love into practice. Even more fundamentally, the conditions of loving are that you have a body here on earth, that you have an avatar here that is separate from me, that we are in relation, and that we are choosing togetherness over difference, conflict, friction. This summer has been filled with lessons of love. For many years, I thought love was this thing I had to work at, that this inherent separateness from the other would always leave me with this feeling of yearning. I've seriously considered that all of my loverships would be filled with an unexplainable inherent angst, that the inexplicable difference of the other would be something that I could never overcome. Learning about the way love could be so easy came as an unexpected surprise. There were many times when I thought the rug would be pulled out from under me, that this ease couldn't possibly belong to me. And yet I showed up the way I always show up in loving, giving it all I had, and I was met there again and again. Romance has always been my art form in all of my relationships, romantic, platonic, and with the self. To me, it feels like expanding the richness of life, creating little pockets outside of time where the enjoyment of the present moment is taken as a serious and worthwhile consideration. There are many pathways here. Sometimes you find yourself walking home or riding a bike and wonder creeps up on you like an old friend. Sometimes it's intentional. It involves tools and rituals to deepen reality. Lighting a candle, having a long morning or a late night, a playlist, a vice, a journal, a letter, a walk, telling a story about the experience you're having, and suddenly you're transported. Loving is creating that fertile environment. I've been going back and forth this whole summer on whether I would stay in the city come September. My lease was going to be up, my job would be over. It was the perfect time to make a move. And yet, at the Holiday Inn, the one in the small town by the cemetery near the highway, I thought, what if I stayed? And on the plane back, my decision was made. I've never lived anywhere longer than 4 years. My childhood was punctuated by constant chapters of newness and moving. I know how to leave, but do I know how to stay? When I got back to the city, I biked around. I realized that every neighborhood I passed through I had a memory in. There was an iteration of myself that was now long gone, but still walked the streets. And yet, these hauntings didn't crowd me. There was still this big open space. What if I stayed? One way or another, finite love is subject to ending. It is bound by time. If you cling, it will teach you to let go. Even the mountains change, even rocks erode. Nothing here will be as it is. It is a great teacher, a good lover. And yet, something else carries on. It's like this: everyone I've ever loved before, I still love in that space that is beyond time. I think people experience this most poignantly in loss, that aspect of love that knows no boundaries of death, that persists beyond any notion of time. There's something like a cosmic joke here. When you learn how to let go, you discover what is forever. When you respect the sovereignty of the other to leave you, to stop loving you, you discover that nothing can really ever be taken. In this way, finite love is the finger, infinite love is the moon. When I was 18, I got my first tattoo on my side by my ribs. I got it based on a dream I had at 17. In the dream, I was getting some words, remember, tattooed on me in a language I couldn't understand. Someone asked me what it meant, and I said with stunning clarity, we have all the knowledge inside us when we are born, and then we forget. We spend our lives trying to remember again. I got remember in Korean on my side, except I didn't know any Korean at the time. I discreetly asked my grandparents for confirmation it was the right word, and they said yes. But much later, I found out that the word was more closely connected to memories. This was initially embarrassing, and then it was just funny, though the sentiment stuck with me. I've spent my whole life forgetting and remembering again that thing that is beyond words. There was another moment. A lonely winter evening, my first year away from my family. I was walking home and the streetlights were casting shadows in the snow. My long blue shadow in the orange snow reminded me of some book I read as a kid. And there was something else there that I couldn't quite pinpoint, a connectedness of all things, something that was outside of time that thread itself through it all. Infinite love is neutral. It does not know good or bad. It does not know death or time. It does not know separation or boundaries. It does not know words. It meets you exactly where you are. It knows no conditions. Love is. You forget it many times just to turn around and discover that infinite well of oneness has always been there, right behind you. I was in the nail salon and I heard, even suffering is perfect. A deep calm came over me, another remembering. Of course, even suffering is perfect. Love meets us exactly where we are. Even without a conduit, it is there. It is always there. One day I felt lost and desperate. I talked to the moon. The moon, of course, said nothing, and yet it was wholly comforting. The feeling wasn't indifference nor understanding. The moon just is as it is. And I realized that I too could be as I was. I learned something about love that evening. It would be not enough to say it is hard to know this love when it is everywhere. It is more like asking if a fish can know water. It can be hard to know love when you are swimming in it. It all can be a pathway back home. In a small town in Saskatchewan, there is a cairn, a monument of rocks, symbols of that which carries on long after everyone we have ever known will have left the earth, that which we will return home to after it is all said and done. Perhaps all this time it has just been the two of us, you and me traversing the cosmos, merging, falling apart, loving, hating, building boundaries and taking them down again, dancing this dance that was invented for just you and me, so together we can learn every shape of love, every corner, every door to be opened and entered. I'll be the mountain and you can be the river. We can languish in the sun and you can have your way with me, carving, pushing through in ways that only eons can afford. Carving, pushing through in ways only eons can afford. Remembering some truth in the friction. Don't worry, we have all the time to figure it out. But for now, you can layer me on thick, and we can brave the void together and do what we do best, make something out of nothing. Just the two of us, marking each other with enter and exit wounds, having an argument that separates us for a century or two, only to find our way back to each other again. I find you everywhere, in every encounter, you shapeshifter, soul sifter. How often I've misrecognized you just to look in your eyes and know. How often I've misrecognized you just to look in your eyes and know that my cosmic lover is upon me. Here we meet once again and again and again. It's you and me all the way down. Hi, it's me signing off. If you watch the whole video newsletter, thank you so much. I have a newsletter hosted on Substack, so you can find that link in the description. And also, I do tarot card readings, which you can find all the details of also in the description in the bio.